Hey, how you doing? This is John, and welcome to John's Long Box. I'm here live with JM DeMatteis. DeMatteis. Again, this is like the seventh video in a row I pronounced the names wrong.
We should have discussed it before we started, right?
Yeah, you know what? I think that's going to be my thing. I'm just going to say everybody's names wrong from now on. Just go with it.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Oh God, I'm embarrassed already. All right, good night, everybody. It's nice talking to you. Oh, well, first off, I'm a big fan. I've been a fan of yours. Geez, I think your name is one of the first names I started paying attention to when I was collecting comics as a kid. I know you already know. I sent messages on Twitter that Greenberg the Vampire was when I read that, I said I got to follow this guy. You know, and so would you mind talking about that a little bit? I just found it fascinating. A vampire in a Jewish community.
You know, that was pretty early in my career at Marvel. And, you know, when I started at Marvel in 1980, Shooter put me under a freelance contract. I broke in at DC and then moved over to Marvel. And, you know, I was writing a lot of mainstream stuff. I was writing probably at that point, you know, Captain America, the Defenders, Marvel Team Up, all this stuff.
All that great stuff. I love
and, you know, still really finding my way as a writer and finding my voice, trying to figure out how you do this. And, you know, when you're writing that material, especially then when I was learning the craft, it's almost like, you know, the superhero stories can be a bit of a box. You know, there's certain tropes of the genre, and I had a lot to learn before I could bring sort of my own personal point of view within that box and spread it out a little bit. But the interesting thing with Greenberg, the original Greenberg story was done for a black and white magazine called Bizarre Adventures.
Yes.
Steve Lealoa and I, and it was a story that I'd had, and I originally wrote it as a short story. Then I started working on it as a screenplay. I never finished it. So these characters had lived in my head for quite some time. And Denny O'Neil was editing Bizarre Adventures, and just by the title, you know, you could go a little to the left and get into a little stranger arenas. And I pitched it to him, and he went, "Fine, let's do it." And what I found interesting, because you know, I was really pretty new to the business at this point, and I don't remember getting a tremendous response to the work that I was doing at the time. Happily, a lot of those stories now, in retrospect, people have discovered and appreciated, and I'm very, very grateful. But Greenberg, the first Greenberg story came out, and I went up to the office one day, and everybody's like, "What a great story! Oh, I love that story. What was that story? That was great." And it took me years to figure out why. And I think the reason why was I wasn't doing a Marvel comic. So a lesson I would learn even more deeply when I did Moonshadow a couple of years later. Because I wasn't doing a Marvel comic. I was just writing my own unique story, my own unique way. These were my characters and my world. They weren't part of something else. I wasn't echoing the voices of the other writers I loved who'd written Defenders or Captain America or whatever. It was just me. Also interesting looking back at that, in a way for me, it's kind of a forerunner of JLI, because there was a lot of humor in that story. It was a serious horror story, right, but it had a lot of humor to it as well. So I was very delighted with the response to the story. And then I think I pitched Shooter on, I'd love to do a Greenberg graphic novel. And it was like, I don't know about that, because it wasn't exactly, you know, the kind of character you're going to launch into the world. Although now, you know, with Marvel uncovering everything and turning everything into TV and movies, you never know, right?
You never know, yeah.
And then a couple of years later, my contract was up, and I was negotiating about a new contract. DC had made me an offer to go back there. And I was talking to Shooter about staying at Marvel. I said, well, there's two things I really want to do. One is this thing called Moonshadow that I'd love to do.
Which I love.
Thank you. Which I ended up doing for Epic. And I said, I really want to do that Greenberg graphic novel. And since I was sort of negotiating in that moment, he said, sure, go ahead, let's do that. And I had worked with Mark Badger on a Gargoyle miniseries, which is one of my favorite things that I did for Marvel. Well, thank you. I applaud your good taste.
I'm a fanboy, and when I say fanboy, I mean I gush, you know. So I got to get that out of my system. And
that's okay.
Everything you write. If the only, you know, I'll talk later about something that I missed that I absolutely love. I just rediscovered it. But
okay, great.
Anything with your name on it, I try to get, you know.
I appreciate that. Believe me, I don't take that for granted. I genuinely and sincerely appreciate that. So anyway, Badger and I had worked together on Gargoyle, And so when I was setting up the Greenberg graphic novel, which Ann Nesenti edited, I pulled Mark in, and that was just, again, it was like I wasn't in that universe of that world of those characters. I was in my own universe and my own world. And that graphic novel remains also one of my favorite things that I've ever done. And about, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, Marvel put out a new edition that had the Lealoha story in it and the graphic novel all together. I don't know if it's still in print, but I'm sure it's out there and you can get it. But that's clearly one of the more obscure things I've ever done, and yet it remains one of my all-time favorite projects.
It's like near and dear to my heart. Like I was fascinated with the idea of like, oh, Star David acts like a cross because it's the faith. It really changed the way I thought about vampires. Like they weren't scared of crosses, so no more arms of a windmill like you see in the old Hammer films. It's the idea of a devout person, of a good person with faith. And I really thought that was a powerful statement. That was the first time I thought of, well, you made me think of it. I didn't think of it. And I thought it was really, really cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. It was like I said, it was a character that I lived with. So I knew those characters very, very well, and now it makes me want to pull it off the shelf and take a look at it again. Cause I haven't looked at it in years and years and years.
And then you followed it up with Moonshadow, which I just remember looking at that. I was working at a comic book store at the time, and I just remember I was putting comics on the shelf, and I just stopped, and I can't recall the next time I just got wrapped up just looking at it. You know what I mean? Like we all know comic books, the first thing that sucks you in is the artwork. You know what
absolutely,
I mean?
absolutely. So John JM, yeah.
Oh, beautiful. And I was just like, and then I was like, oh, this is the same guy that did Greenberg. You know what I mean? So I was working at a comic book store, getting everything, and I just remember putting that on the side and excited to go home and read that. So.
And that was the book, that really, for me as a writer, that allowed me to, because I had 12 issues. Greenberg was like basically these two stories. I probably was working on Moonshadow and the Greenberg graphic novel at the same time. But Moonshadow gave me so much room and so much space to sit down. And in my brain, it was no longer, I'm writing a comic book. It's like, I'm just writing the way I would sit down and write a novel. And to be partnered with someone like John Muth, I mean, that was the first painted comic book series ever done in America. I just had lunch with him a couple of days ago. We're good friends, and we still keep in touch. We still see each other.
You still in Brooklyn?
What? Oh, I haven't lived in Brooklyn in 40 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a long time ago. But you can take the boy out of Brooklyn, but you can't take the Brooklyn out of the boy.
Yeah, I just had Jimmy Palmiotti on my channel a couple weeks ago, talking about pizza and knishes and pretzels.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. You've covered everything right there. Pizza, knishes, and a hot pretzel, right?
Yeah.
Or not stick pretzels and an egg cream. That was my big thing when I was a kid.
You're funny. Me and Jimmy Palmiotti lamented we can't find good egg creams anymore. You talk to Brooklyn people, this is what you talk about.
I maintain that a really good egg cream, first of all, needs to be made by a Jewish man at least over 60 in a glass. Yes. It can't be a paper cup. Forget the paper cup egg.
No, everything tastes better in a glass.
And when when I was a kid, the guy his name was Max, who ran this candy store. Max and Eva, these two old people. They probably weren't that old, but to me as a kid, they seemed like
they were probably 45, like Archie Bunker, right. 45.
Right, exactly. And they would make the egg cream in like those classic Coke glasses.
Yeah, those curvy
and then
glasses.
When they mix it up, the spoon, there was the sound of the spoon knocking it as it was mixing it, and then I'd get a stick pretzel and an egg cream, and I was in heaven, man. And then same store sold comics. So you'd grab a comic book, have an egg cream and a stick pretzel, and you're on your way. All of which has nothing to do with Moonshadow, but it was a nice diversion.
But you know what? It all of the comic book creators, the original guys, and then I guess you would be third generation, fourth generation comic book guys, they're all Brooklyn, Queens, New York people with all the same stories. So you have it in your DNA. I think it's the egg cream. If you don't make egg creams, you haven't.
I haven't had an egg cream in years, and now you're making me want. I'm gonna have to read Greenberg and get an egg cream now.
So I remember back to Moonshadow. I remember that was like, to me, my teenage brain. I was like, this is important, And I had a friend's dad who was a professor, and he was like, comic books are trash, comic books are worthless, and I remember. Like I was like an evangelist, showing him Greenberg, and I was showing him, Moonshadow, and saying this is not what you're thinking of back, whatever I don't know what he thought. I can't even imagine somebody who thought comic books were trash. And I was trying, and he was just like he wouldn't even look. I got so mad at him.
Oh, so you never even got, he wouldn't
He
read
would,
it?
he wouldn't. He went to his grave, And the sad
Oh,
thing is,
wow.
his daughter used to come to my comic book store, and she would go in the bathroom. We didn't let anybody use the bathroom, but we let her go in the bathroom because she would take her shirt off and stuff all her comics, in her bra and everything.
Oh, so she could hide them when she brought them home?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's how
wow.
bad it was. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That's funny. Well, when I was a kid, they were viewed as kids material.
Right.
And at a certain point, you were supposed to outgrow it.
Yeah.
I never outgrew it. Some people had periods where they stopped reading and then they came back to it. I never stopped. It was, when I was a teenager, hanging out on the streets of Brooklyn, doing all kinds of things we shouldn't talk about here. Most of the people around me weren't reading comics, but I still was always reading them, always, because I felt like, for me, comics continued to grow up as I grew up. By the time I was a teenager, I'm reading guys like, Steve Englehart and Steve Gerber, who really was,
Steve Gerber. I was too young to appreciate. Now
yeah,
I appreciate
Len and Marv and all those guys who were really pushing at the boundaries. Gerber was a huge influence, but all those guys were. And then when I got into business, Len was a very huge influence because he kind of became my mentor in the business in my early years.
So you mentioned a lot of great names: Jim Shooter, Ann Nocenti, and Denny O'Neil. Jim Shooter seems to elicit a strong response with people. I'm a big fan. Never met the guy, never worked with the guy, but sometimes you mention his name and people roll their eyes, and then sometimes you mention the name like, yeah, great. So not to put you on the spot, but how is it working with Jim Shooter?
Both of those reactions are true, because here's the shocking truth. Like all of us, Jim Shooter's a human being, which means he's full of contradictions. I'm full of contradictions. You're full of contradictions. So I had fantastic experiences with Jim and some unpleasant experiences with Jim. But when I weigh it all, I look at the good and the bad. For me, the good far outweighs the bad. He opened the door to Marvel for me. He treated me very well. And then, later on we had creative disagreements and I left, but it's nothing that's like, oh, that Jim Shooter, what a terrible guy or anything. Here's the problem, and not with Jim, with the position he was in. When you're the editor-in-chief, whether you're Jim or Tom DeFalco or Joe Quesada, whoever it is, you're making decisions that impact this large group of people.
Right.
Or the same thing, if you're the president of the United States, to put it on a bigger scale.
Yeah. So
you make a decision, half the people are going to go, great decision, and half the people are going to go, that's the worst decision that it's ever been made, So you can't help but alienate some people when you're in that position. And I think Jim, to be honest, Jim did alienate a lot of people. Sometimes his people skills were not the best, and other times his people skills were phenomenal. So I like I said, I look back on it and I have mostly positive view of my experiences with Jim, because he really opened a lot of doors for me. Really opened a lot of doors for me.
I imagine trying to herd a bunch of creative people is, it's got to be like herding cats. You know what I mean? Like creative, yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
In that era, there were a lot of great people working on staff. There was Mark Gruenwald and Carl Potts and Danny Fingeroth and Bob Budiansky and Ann Nocenti and all these people. It was a great time at Marvel.
Legends, everyone.
I would love go. I'd go to the office. I'd come in and I'd spend the day, and I'd just go from office to office, and we were all friends. And just forget the work. We would just hang out and talk, and it was just a great group of people.
I used to daydream as a kid of just going to Marvel, and I just pictured like paper airplanes and people talking and talking about Spider-Man. You know what I mean? I'm sure
it was. It was. I mean, as the years passed, both at Marvel and DC, I think things have gotten a little more corporate and a little quieter, but in those days it was really kind of a fun free-for-all. But the joke is, you grow up reading the comics. Like I'm growing up and I'm reading the Lee Kirby stuff, right? Or then in the 70s, those other guys that I mentioned. But, by the time I get to Marvel, it's a completely different company because the company keeps changing, So whatever you have in your head, by the time you get there, doesn't exist anymore.
Right. In 2010, I was the electrician at Marvel.
Oh, really?
And I went in there and it was Oh God, I wish I never went. It was the reality was like a cold bucket of water over my head, you know.
Right. Well, I remember going up there, and also same at DC. Like I hadn't been up for a while, and then it was like after 9/11, and suddenly there's all this security, and you got to sign in, and you got to do this, and you got to do that, and you wait here, and then we'll call you, and then you can come directly to this office, and then and all that kind of stuff. Where it used to be so loose, and same thing at DC. I had all the people worked at DC were my friends. Whether it was Karen Berger, Andy Helfer, Bob Greenberger, all these people.
I love Karen Berger. I think Karen Berger is like one of the unsung heroes of comic books.
I think she's pretty well sung. I think people appreciate and know what she did. Well, to talk about Brooklyn, Karen and I go back way before either one of us were ever in comics. We're old friends from Brooklyn. Yeah. So I was her door into DC. I was working at DC for, this must have been 1979. So I sold my first script to DC in December of 1977. Got work from them for 6 months on those those anthology books, Weird War Tales, House of Mystery, all that stuff. The DC implosion came. They kicked me out on my ass because they had to give the work to the people that had been there for a while. So I was out, and I didn't start getting regular work till for 79, right? And then probably Karen graduated from Brooklyn College. We both were in Brooklyn College together at a certain point. And I was sitting with Paul Levitz one day, and he said, "Oh, I'm looking for an assistant." He was editorial coordinator then. He was the guy that was in charge of making sure all the trains ran on time, along with being an editor. He was the guy that bought me. Today is actually Paul Levitt's birthday. So happy birthday, Paul.
Oh, happy birthday,
Paul. He bought my first comic book script. It was Paul that I sold it to. So I said, "Oh, I have this friend, Karen, who just graduated from Brooklyn College with a journalism degree, and she's really smart." He said, "Well, send her up." So I sent her up, and the rest from that moment, the rest is literally history,
Wow, you changed comics.
That's right. I take responsibility for everything. Yes, that's right.
I'll give it to you, man. You're a legend. So speaking of World War, you created the Creature Commandos at that time period.
Yes, which is very funny to me now that same thing. I sell my first scripts to Paul, and he's editing House of Mystery, Weird War Tales, all this stuff. So, you're learning your craft, you're selling these 5 to 8 page stories. And I remember, probably in around June of 78, right before the implosion, I'm thinking of ideas, and I'm thinking Weird War Tales, Weird War. Why didn't anyone think of this before? Classic monsters fighting World War II. So I remember writing this idea down, and then the implosion came. So I never got to pitch it to Paul. So a year goes by or whatever, and now I'm back at DC. I'm working with Len Wein, and Len and I, we hit it off right from the start. He just not just a great writer, but a truly wonderful human being. I loved Len. Still miss him. And he wanted to start putting regular series into House of Mystery and Weird War Tales. So I dusted off this idea that I had about the monsters fighting World War II. He loved it. And either Len did or together we came up with the title Creature Commandos, because I didn't have a title for it when I pitched it. And so, I think I did 6 of them before I went over to Marvel. And here we are 40 something years later. And actually just a few weeks ago, I was on a Zoom call with James Gunn talking about, what he's doing with Creature Commandos and other things. Awesome. And whoever thought, you know what I mean? Now I know what they're doing is going to be very different from the original concept, but it's still born of that original concept. And it will still benefit me in many ways. So it's a very cool thing.
All the comic book movies are fishing back 40 years ago. I mean,
exactly.
Who would ever thought that my nieces and nephews would have Groot toys? You know?
Well, we can thank my dear friend Keith Giffen for that one, because he's the one that put them together.
Yeah.
That he set that template with those characters that they then used in those movies.
Well, now I was going to ask you about Keith Giffen. Sadly, he passed. For those of you who don't know in the audience, a tremendous talent. I'm a Keith Giffen fanboy too, and then you two put together some sort of chemical that was, I don't know what it was, but
I don't know what it was either. And I am a Keith Giffen, fanboy too. I was, obviously I've been thinking about Keith a lot these past few weeks. I would urge anybody, if you want to go to my website, jmdmatteis.com, I wrote a whole tribute to Keith on there, talking about him and our years of collaboration. And, I say he was the Jack Kirby of my generation of comic book creators. He was just, I always use this example, and it sounds funny, but it's true. When my son was little, he had a plastic bubble bear. It was a plastic bear. And you'd press the bear's belly. You put that bubble fluid in. You'd press the bear's belly. His head would pop up, and bubbles would come out. And that was Keith. Press his belly, his head pops up, and ideas would pop out. And if you didn't like those ideas, press it again. You'll get a dozen more. In this article that I wrote, I talk about this one story, and it's a small thing, but it's the definition of Keith's creativity. This is back in our JLI days, and we were up at DC some Friday afternoon because everyone would show up on Friday because that's when the checks came down. We'd all hang out in Andy Helfer's office, but we were out in the hall, and we were doing, for Secret Origins, we were going to do the secret origin of Nort, who was a character from our JLI run who I have this ridiculous amount of love for because he's such a wonderful, wonderful, ridiculous character who I hold very dear. So Keith says, I have this great idea for the Nort origin, and he proceeds to tell me the whole idea is every little detail, and I'm listening, and I went, that doesn't work for me. And Keith, rather than saying, hey, fuck you, Keith is like, he takes a breath and then completely on the spot creates a whole other story.
Wow.
On the spot. And I went, yeah, that's the one we'll do. And then, of course, the fun of working with him is that he lays it out in the plot. He used to draw his plots out like little mini comics.
Oh, cool.
And then I always had the freedom to do, and I remember on that the Nort story, I probably put more copy in that story than any story I've ever written. And if you know my story, that means that means there's a lot of copy. So I got to write, with Keith, I'd get to write another story on top of his story, and they would complement each other, And the beauty of working with Keith was there was no creative ego. He encouraged me to do that. Other people would say, what have you done to my plot? Why did you change this? Why did you add this other storyline? Why did you do this with the characters? Keith would love what I would do, and then he would take what I would do and build on that. And even in, I always say when we were working on JLI, we didn't really talk about the stories much. We'd see each other at the office. Andy would send me the plots. I'd write the script, and that was that. When we got back together 10 years later for formerly known as the Justice League, that's when the three idiots, me, Keith, and Kevin, kind of realized, this is pretty good what we do together. It took us that long because it was just, at the time, it was a great gig, but it was just a gig. It was over, and we all moved on to other things, When we got back together, we all realized this is really something special. We need to hold on to this.
That was special. That's like one of the highlights of comics, if you ask me. If we would have mentioned like the top 10 runs of all time, that's on a lot of people's lists, including mine,
we had no idea what we were doing. It just happened, and that to look back all these years later, that people are still reading it and discovering it. And I just saw the other day that they're putting out the third omnibus in February, I think.
Oh,
so that's great.
Fourth Age, hello, check out his channel. RJ is one of the first guys to ever give me a break, so I'm just incredibly loyal to RJ.
So to get back to Keith for a second, so even later when we would talk, once we got back together, we would talk a lot on the phone. We'd talk about the stories, but it didn't matter what we talked about because by the time we were done talking, Keith would go and do the plot, and whatever came out of his head is what went on the paper, and then I would write whatever came out of my head, and I always say it was like a great game of tennis, hitting the ball back and forth, and between the two of us, we created something that we could never have done alone. It just something magical happened, and you can't create that. You can't control that. It's either there or it's not. And like I said, we didn't even know it was there in the beginning. We were just doing another gig, and here we were. But we finally figured it out, and really we kept working together straight through Scooby Apocalypse, which I think ended in like 2018 or 2019.
You guys were like Lennon and McCartney. You just came together and made some wonderful, wonderful stuff.
Thank you. And so, to lose Keith is a really sad thing. One of the great things in recent years has been that I before COVID, I was doing a lot more conventions than I ever had. And usually Keith was there too. So we spent a lot of time at conventions sitting next to each other and hanging out. And it was just great. He was very invested in projecting the image of the curmudgeon, but he was so much more than that. He was had big-hearted guy, a wonderful, generous collaborator, one of the smartest, funniest people, and flat out, maybe there are other people in the world as creative as Keith, but I don't know if there's anybody more creative than Keith. He was one of the single most creative people I've ever met.
Yeah, he did it all,
He did.
Yeah. I first became a fan of him with his Legion of Superheroes. That was, to me, definitive comic books. Like you cannot surpass his work with Paul Levitzon. That great dog. Oh my God. That's another, how many times is Keith going to end up on my top 10 runs of all time lists. You know,
I was just thinking this morning that actually, even though the world first saw us together on JLI, we did a Dr. Fate miniseries that I wrote and he drew, which we actually that's when I first met him, because it came out a few months after JLI, but we started working on it before then. And that was one of the, you know, I loved when I got to work with him as an artist, because I loved his art, you know. And I was just thinking this morning, I was remembering just meeting Keith, and Denny O'Neil edited that series, and going out to lunch with Keith and Denny, and there's two brilliant guys, and batting ideas around, and it was just that was a great series. I hope DC collects that Dr. Fate stuff someday.
He has the distinctive art style. I've never seen anybody like him before or since. You know, truly unique. And he could, you know, triple threat, right? Color, you know, he could do it all. He could do it all. It's so easy to talk to you. I can't believe half an hour's gone already. But I wanted to talk, because you just did a Kickstarter, and you delivered. You said 4 comics, and then you surprised me with 5 comics. So thank you for the extra comic.
You are welcome.
And I did a couple of videos on my channel. You haven't lost anything.
Thank you.
Each one of these 5 comics are different genres. Each one of them are great. You got great artists. I could gush about them forever, but
please do.
You know, and I'm trying to talk about. I don't want to spoil them because they're still new. People could still. They could still.
Yes, actually, yes. So here, I'll tell you the basic backstory. You know, I thought about. You know, my whole career, I've always gone back and forth, starting with Moonshadow and Greenberg. Well, actually, Greenberg Marvel owns, so it's not really creator owned. So unfortunately, the first Greenberg story came out just before, like, you know, Marvel launched their creator-owned stuff, so Marvel owns that one. But Moonshadow was the first real creator-owned thing I did, and I've always gone back and forth between my, you know, the Marvel DC characters and my own stuff. You know, you know, working for Epic, working for Vertigo, for different publishers, and I'm always looking for new venues. And as years have passed, it's harder and harder, really. Like back when we did Moonshadow and in the early days of Vertigo, you could actually get paid well for your creator-owned work and make a living, and still own it. You know, those days are long gone. Most of the time when you're doing creator-owned work, you're either working for free or you're working for a very, very small amount up front, and you're hoping to get it back on the back end. So I'm always looking for new venues, and I've seen Kickstarter grow over the years, and I was very interested in doing a Kickstarter, but man, it just looked like so much work. So much work. And it is, as I discovered. So I have a friend named David Baldy. David is a TV writer and a producer, and he took one of my writing workshops, and we became friends. And we were talking about this one day, and David said, I'll work on it with you. So tell me some ideas that you have. What do you want to do? So I trotted out a bunch of the first 4 ideas, I think. And David went, let's do them all. Let's do 4 number 1.
Shoot for the moon.
And I thought, what a great idea. Let's get all these ideas out into the world, you know? And so I pulled in, you know, these great artists, Matthew Dow Smith, Sean McManus, oh God, I'm blanking, David Baldion, Tom Mandrake. Yeah, you know, great artists. Guys, you know, Mandrake I wanted to work with for years. I've always loved his stuff. Sean's one of my favorite collaborators. We did 2 years of Dr. Fate together at DC. Matt and I had worked together before. And David and I worked together just, you know, a couple of years ago on the Ben Reilly series for Marvel, and I just fell in love with his work. So that's what we did. Let's put them all out there, and it was fantastic. Now, and as I discovered, even having a partner like David, he's also a really great businessman, because he's, aside from being creative, he's a businessman. It's a lot of work doing these Kickstarters.
Yeah.
So we put out these 4 books. And then I had been working on this other project with my friend Vasilis Godzilis called the Edward Gloom Mysteries. And David said, let's slip it in toward the end as a bonus book. So we did that. So suddenly there are 5 books. Yeah. We put out a wonderful collected edition. I'm looking at the poster right now. It's over there with Liam Sharp. My friend Liam Sharp did a beautiful cover for that. And so the idea was to have everyone vote at the end and see which one of these they wanted to see continue.
All 5.
So what they voted for was everything. Well, Edward Gloom is just the bonus book. So I'm pursuing a different venue for Edward Gloom. But those 4 main books, I've already written pretty much 90% of the scripts for the next chapter in all 4 books. We're waiting for the art to come in. Once we get enough art, because we don't want to launch this and have people waiting forever. One of the good things we did with this Kickstarter was we launched it. in like November or whatever, October, November, and by the spring, everybody had their books.
Yeah, it was quick. It was very quick.
And we want to make, because I've heard stories about people waiting sometimes years for the books to show up, and we didn't want to do that.
That's unfortunate.
So as soon as we get enough art in on these 4 books, we will launch the next Kickstarter, and we'll go from there. So it's very exciting. I mean, it's one of the most exciting projects I've ever been involved in. Yeah, thank you.
I have to say, Layla was my favorite, because to me that was classic. That was classic JM DeMatteis. Just
thank you.
Like very spiritual, very like, I see your photographs in the background, which brings me to Seekers. I don't know what, but I missed Seekers when that first came out. At the time I was in college and I was broke, so it wasn't. I never had that period where I stopped collecting comics. I just reduced because of financial. Right. And I just found Sneakers like 6-7 months ago. And
did you get that collected edition?
No, I gotta get the floppies. I'm a floppy guy.
Okay, because there's a really nice collected edition.
Yeah, I'll get the collected edition now, because I saw what you guys did. Yeah, it looks great, because I love the comic. And
thank you.
It just took me back to your classic work. I went back. I reread Moonshadow. I read Shambhala. In the comments, people have been talking about Doctor Strange, Shambhala, and I just, it was like to get maudlin, I'm getting emotional here. It was like, oh my God, one of my friends. I forgot about one of my friends, and I went back. You know what I mean? It was really good. So I always got the feeling that you were like a very deep spiritual thinker, like a very like you're one of the people I would love to sit down. This is the closest we'll get, I guess, obviously, and just talk about the meaning of life and the nature of the universe. I think it would just be like a rewarding comic. I'm a goofy guy, but I got this spiritual side to me that
well, everyone does in some way, shape, or form, right? Because I always say, and we'll have to save, maybe I'll come back, we'll save this discussion for another time.
I can pontificate. Yeah.
If you're alive on this planet, to me anyway, there are some fundamental questions like,
yes,
who am I? Why am I here? And what does it all mean? And so those questions have obsessed me since I was a teenager. And that led me on my own spiritual search, and my own spiritual path that continues to this day. And Seekers was obviously, as a lot of my work has been, Seekers was a reflection of that. And on Seekers, I got to work with Glenn Barr, who I did Brooklyn Dreams with, Jill Thompson, John J. Muth again, Michael Zulli, amazing artist, So yeah, unfortunately, Seekers, we got canceled after I forget how many issues it was, 15 issues or 16 issues, because I had like 3 years worth of stories worked out, and I had if you look at that last issue, it's extra length, and it kind of wraps up a little too quickly, because I had to. I didn't want to just leave people hanging in the middle of the story, so I tried to give it some sense of conclusion, but it never really concluded the way I wanted it to. But I'm very, very proud of that series.
All right, well, wonderful series. It really, I sat after every issue and. I sat looking at the comic, looking over, thinking about it, made me think about, just life. What are we doing? You know what I mean? Like, I have the feeling, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, that it was very personal, like there was a lot of autobiography in it.
Not autobiographical in the sense that, say, Brooklyn Dreams was, which really was. I changed the names to protect the innocent, but that was that was straight autobiography. But elements of that were. I mean, obviously, I was not that character. Lucas Hart's life and mine were very different.
Good.
But we shared things in common. We shared. But that's the truth is, I could point you to Spider-Man stories that I know are completely autobiographical. The reader doesn't know because it's getting filtered through Peter Parker.
Right. Yeah.
But, if you're doing your work the right way, and you're pouring the essence of who and what you are into all your stories. Even JLI, those characters were real to me because they reminded me of my friends, when I was in my late teens, early 20s. So you always want to invest reality. You always want to be as personal as you can. I tell my writing students, and I always stress it's metaphorical, not literal. Take a knife, stick it in your chest, cut yourself open and bleed onto the pages. That's what you have to do when you're a writer. It just is. And yes, Seekers was very personal, but not necessarily in a literal way.
Yes.
But a lot of, and yet some of it was, some of it wasn't, but it all gets kind of filtered into a sort of metaphor and symbolism and all different things. I mean, Moonshadow was a space fantasy, but it was completely autobiographical in its own way. Moonshadow and Brooklyn Dreams are the same story. One of them is told in the form of a space fantasy, and one of them is the literal story of my teenage years.
So when you were, I had to brush up on you. You wanted to be a musician. You were a musician.
I was a musician, yeah, and I was a rock and roll journalist, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
So did you want to? Am I getting this wrong? Do you wanted to be an artist too, a comic artist?
When I was a kid, that was my first thing. My first creative outlet was drawing. I spent half my childhood on the living room floor with paper and pencil and crayons, just drawing. I got accepted out of high school. I got accepted to the School of Visual Arts. So here's this dumb kid from Brooklyn, doesn't know anything. I get accepted and I go home and my parents look at this stuff. We can't afford that. I literally didn't even know there was such a thing as financial aid. I had no clue. I was just a working class kid from Brooklyn. So I went, all right, I guess I'm not going to art school,
People like us don't do things like that,
Right, exactly. I don't blame my parents. They didn't know. They didn't understand. They had never been to college. They didn't know anything about it. And I sometimes think, what would have happened if I had followed that particular path and developed those skills? But what I only, I'm very dense. What I only realized recently was the fact that I spent so many years of my life drawing, regardless of the fact that I am, quote, a writer, I see things visually, which allows me to work in this medium and do comics, because I have that visual sense.
So many comic writers that I've been talking to, they said that they wanted to be artists first, and either they didn't have the discipline, the talent, or whatever, or life gets in the way, but they kind of draw out a couple of panels here and to help the artist. I think that's more common than we know.
And I'm very visual in the way that I see stories. You know what I mean? I sometimes I will literally wake up in the morning and watch a movie in my head, and see it unfold. Or if I'm writing a script, I see if it's full script. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll write the whole thing in the visuals first, panel one, the whole thing, 20 pages, just the visuals, and then go back and add the copy after the fact, And sometimes I do the reverse. Sometimes I'll just write the copy, but I'm seeing the visuals in my head while I'm writing it. And then you go back and you adjust it later.
Well, you're also a novelist. Do you have different techniques when you do your novels and do your comic scripts?
It's the same thing. I've written a lot of TV and a lot of animation and for animated TV and the DC animated movies. And they're all different forms. You have to learn the form. Like, if you're writing for TV, it's not the same as writing a comic book script, and It's not the same as writing prose. It's all different. But what's the same is story is story is story. And the elements that you need are the same. The way you express those elements are different. Prose is really sort of a really wide open door, because there's no limit on what you can do. It's just you. It's just the writer and the words, and that's it. And I've just the past couple of years gotten back to it. Last year, I put out a novella called The Excavator, which is available on Amazon. Please, wonderful illustrations by Vasilis, who did Edward Bloom Mysteries, did the illustrations for it. And just last month, I put out a new novella called The Witness, with art by J.H. Williams III, one of the most amazing artists on the planet.
Yeah.
And I'm working, and I'm just this past couple of weeks started work on a new novella that will be out next year. Yeah. So it's been really great getting back to prose, but I hadn't written prose for about 10 years. I had a young adult fantasy called Imaginalis that came out maybe 2010. So it was more than 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And it was like going back to the gym and working those muscles, So working on that first one was like, wow, this is a little heavy, and then you start working it. And so by the time I got to the Witness, it was like those muscles had been worked and I could just dive right in, But I'm very proud of both those stories. And I hope people check them out.
Oh, wow. You mentioned Peter Parker, which again I have to talk about the Kraven's Last Hunt, one of the greatest Spider-Man stories of all time. I remember, again, I was super broke and I still had money to buy that comic. And one of my roommates in college, who was not a comic book guy, he came up to me and goes, "Did you read these?" And he had them all. And he was just like, friends of his gave them to him to read. And he's trying to share with me. And I was like, I already got, you know what I mean? But it was just something about that story, man. It's a great story, I thought Marvel really took a risk with that. It was I thought, a poignant story.
It's interesting. First of all, it's sort of like with JLI. When you're working on this stuff, you're not thinking 40 years from now, there'll be new editions coming out in hardcover and people will still be talking about it or reading it for the first time. It's just, this is the gig right now, They asked me if I wanted to write, it actually started, it was supposed to be a run on Spectacular Spider-Man.
Right.
And then they brought Zek in. And then, I pitched them the story, and you think it's like, it was a very intense story. You think there was no resistance. It was like, that's great, go ahead. And then the original original editor was Jim Owsley, who as Christopher Priest. And then he left, and Jim Salicrup came in. And Salicrup was the guy who said, oh, we can't have this going on in Spectacular Spider-Man. Peter, Spider-Man's dead while he's fighting Dr. Octopus over in Amazing Spider-Man. And he was the first guy in the business who said, let's run it through all the books. And everybody's been copying that ever since. And that was a great thing. That really added to the impact of the story. So many little kind of coincidences, even the fact that he was in the black costume, that he'd just gotten married. All these things came together, I think. And plus the fact that, as I often say, I was going through hell in my personal life at the time.
Oh, no.
So all that hell went into the story too. So the emotions are very authentic. I felt as buried alive as Peter Parker while I was writing.
It was a very emotional story.
Yeah.
All the characters.
But even then, it's done. Okay, the story's over. Oh, that's nice. It seemed to sell well, Oh, great. Nice royalty check. And then you move on and you forget about it. And then suddenly, when they collected that in hardcover in whatever it was, 1987 or 1988 or whatever year it was, they weren't doing that a lot. So that was a big deal, let alone that it's been continually reprinted ever since, So, and that I go to conventions and probably a third of what I sign is Kraven's Last Hunt. And when people come up and say, and even on Twitter, I just read this last week for the first time. As a writer, what more could you ask for people, to be discovering your work for the first time 40 years after a story came out? Very cool.
Yeah, it was a great story. Yeah.
And I got to give props to Mike Zeck, because I always say this, and this is really true. Had someone else drawn that story, we might not be having this conversation today.
Yeah,
comics is writing and art, and you cannot separate them.
Absolutely, 100%. I say this a million times. The art will draw me to a comic. The writing will keep me with the comic.
That's a great way to put it. And again, we talk about chemistry with Keith. Same thing with Mike. You can't create that chemistry. Something, Mike and I, we had 3 years working on, was it maybe 2 years together working on Captain America, where we built up those muscles. So when we got to Kraven, we picked up where we left off, and it was just, we were just off. And of course, Bob McLeod with the great inking, and every element of a story has to work. The lettering, the coloring, everything. Rick Parker's lettering on that story, phenomenal. Every element has to come together to make a story work. You can't, I know as a reader, I was writing, as much as I love the art, I could put up with crummy art if I loved the writer. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
this is a great Steve Gerber story. I'll ignore whatever in some random issue. Maybe they had to fill in artist that wasn't that good. Right. But really, for it all to work, it's all got to work. It's all same thing. With film. So I learned writing for television. You can write a good script, but if the actor's not delivering a good performance, or if the actor has a good performance but it's not directed well, it all has to work.
Yes. Yeah. Very rarely do you have one guy does everything. Not everybody's a Frank Miller or you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, and if you could do everything, man, then this is the business for you. There's no other business you should be in than comics if you can write and draw,
And for like Kraven's Last Hunt, like the stars were right. Everything that is just such a good.
Yeah. Do folks out there? I saw a lot of things flashing by. I haven't really. I know. Do they have questions, or
anybody want to ask questions? JM is opening the door.
Ask a question. So before we get to the questions, I'll just plug the current project, which is Magneto, and I always say Magneto, not Magneto. I'm sorry.
All right, since we're talking Magneto, I got to get it.
Okay, there you go. That's great. I might have to get one of those now that I've written this series.
I just can't hear, so I got to take a. You can't read my thoughts, and I can't hear your words when
That's right. I'm doing this with Todd Nauk or no. I've never pronounced. You can't pronounce my name, and I can't pronounce Todd's name.
That's good because I mispronounced your name. So now we're even.
We'll keep it. I think it's Nauk. Anyway, phenomenal artist, phenomenal storyteller. It's been we've been in the business, both of us for a long time, never worked together. And this is a story that really explores the the contradictions. And when I was a kid, the first Marvel comic I really glommed onto was X-Men, and
Okay.
in the early X-Men, Magneto was just like as one-dimensional a villain as you're going to find anywhere. And then you have over these years the subtlety and the nuance and the things that Claremont did. So this story is a way to look at those, through the lens of those early Magneto stories. It takes place while he's taken over for Xavier with the New Mutants, and to see what was really going on, in his head. And it's a really, really deep exploration of the character. And I'm really, really happy the way it's turned out. I see it. Oh, you want to say something, and then I'll take that question.
I think that's why he's a lasting character. It is the contradictions. He's
not
just.
Yeah, and that's what I love. I love characters that are filled with contradictions, and he may have more than any character in the Marvel universe.
And you could sympathize with where he's coming from, but where he's going, you gaze not into the abyss lest you become,
Exactly. And there's a line I I don't want to get into, because I don't want to give away too much about the story.
Yes, no spoilers. Go and buy the comic.
Yeah, I'm really, really happy. Third issue just came out a couple of weeks ago. The fourth issue will be out next month.
He's got to make $1 million in this interview. It all depends.
We could do a little telethon. Just send money.
We're not above that.
We have a question here about working on Doctor Strange with Dan Green. So I don't want to be morbid, but Dan too just passed away a couple of months ago.
Yes.
And again, Dan is someone who I knew, for 40 years, when not just as a fellow creator, but our families knew each other. Our children grew up together, So that was another tremendous loss and tremendous sadness when Dan died. Working on Into Shambhala was great. It was fantastic. Because we were friends, because we lived near each other. It was a total collaboration. We created the story together. It wasn't my story and his art. It was our story. We built that story together, brick by brick. Interesting at the time, Dan and John J. Muth shared a studio together in our town.
Oh, wow.
So I used to go up to their studio, and John is at one table doing Moonshadow, and Dan's at the other doing Into Shambhala, and when you work that closely, just the way Kent Williams and I also, when we did Blood of Tail, worked that way, because Kent literally lived next door to me when we were working on that.
Wow.
When you work that closely with people, something else happens too, So working with Dan on that was a pleasure. We both poured ourselves and our passions. I'd have this idea and he'd have that idea, and then I'd write something up, and then he'd draw it, and then I'd change this and he'd change that, and it grew that way. Yeah, and it's still again, we're talking about the projects that are really near and dear to my heart. That's still all these years later.
And we still love them.
And that Marvel hasn't reprinted that Doctor Strange graphic novel. The painted. Forget the story. The art alone, Dan's art. Dan is known as an inker, but what an artist!
Yeah.
What an artist. And this beautiful painted art. And it really deserves. I have hardcover collections from like Italy and Brazil, and that hasn't been reprinted in America probably, since the 80s or 90s or something. So come on, Marvel, get on the stick.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder about Marvel.
Here
we have another question. My question to you, Mr. DeMatteis, is what is the inspiration for Impossible Incorporated when you went to IDW Publishing?
Oh, great question. It brings up another great artist, a friend of mine, Mike Cavallero. Mike and I did a project for IDW called The Life and Times of Savior 28, which is one of my favorite projects of all time. A story that took 25 years to get out into the world, because it started as a Captain America story and evolved into that. And then Mike and I were talking about what to do next. And I wanted to do something through a modern lens that had sort of the innocence, the wonder, and the imagination of Silver Age comics, but through a modern lens. Yeah. And so that's what we attempted to do. And I really, really loved that series. It's probably most people watching this are going, Impossible Incorporated, what the hell's that? They probably haven't heard of it. There's a collected edition out there. Check it out. It's about this. It owes certainly a great debt also to Lee and Kirby and Fantastic Four. The team of genius. Except the genius is not Reed Richards. It's a 16-year-old girl at this point. Her father was sort of the Reed Richards character, but he disappeared when she was young, and she has no idea whatever happened to him. And she had to step up and take over this team, which is busy exploring all of time and space. So it's a personal quest for her father against the backdrop of all this kind of cosmic fun and games. I would love to do more. I would love to do more with
this. Is right up, this is just your stuff. It's wonderful superhero, and then it's got that longing. Like, to me, when I read your work, the word longing keeps coming into play. Seekers was filled with longing. Greenberg the Vampire had like longing, like bittersweet, painful, but pleasure. You know, I don't get that from many writers except for you. You know.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I don't know. I'm getting emotional. I shouldn't be. Does JM?
Wait. Why shouldn't you be?
I don't know.
It's honest.
Because I'm a New Yorker. We're tough.
Yeah, we all have a tough shell and big mushy hearts, right?
I oughta, you know. Does JMD see a future in crowdfunded indie? Good question. As a new partner into the industry, excellent question.
I got to tell you, after my experience with my Kickstarter, and then now if you look around, it's like every 15 minutes I see another creator launching another Kickstarter, because what's great about it, despite all the hard work that has to go into it. I got to tell you, after a month of crowdfunding, I just wanted to get in bed, pull the covers off my head, and not get out for a month.
Yeah,
but it's like there's no wall between you and the audience. You know what I'm saying? You're not going through a publisher. I'm not going through an editor or this or that. I had David there for feedback to say, to read the stories and give me a little feedback. But basically, it's just me and the artist, straight to the audience. No wall between us. And look at what just happened with that Neil Gaiman, Colleen Doran thing. Do you know about that?
Yeah, the glass.
No. They did. Colleen is doing an adaptation of Good Omens as a graphic novel, and apparently they took it to all these publishers. All these publishers said no, they didn't want to do it, so they crowdfunded it. And you know how much money they made?
Oh, millions.
$3 million.
Yeah.
And now obviously this is a rare case. It's Neil Gaiman. It's a hit TV show, and Colleen is so hugely talented.
I'm dying to talk to her. Her Distant Soil is a very personal comic.
And her work has just evolved over the years, and she is better than ever. But so crowdfunding opens up a whole other door there. It's a lot of work. You have to take on a lot of responsibility, but the rewards are really fantastic as well.
So let me add an addendum to this question. You said before that your partner was a business guy. Would you have done this without your partner, the crowdfunding?
No, on myself, not in a million years. I would have had a nervous breakdown.
Yeah, I again, forgive me for being personal, but are you business minded? Because I'm going to do a crowdfunding one, and I'm not business minded at all. Am I just gonna throw my money into the streets, people?
I'm like, I have this really big right brain, and my left brain is just kind of sputtering along there. So no, there have been rare occasions over the years where I had good business sense, but it really helps to have people around you who have good business sense, which I have been lucky enough to have,
And Marcus Kelliger, do you prefer to write comics full script or Marvel method? I think you're
another fantastic. Like we'll talk about this. The DeMatteis. 2 of the books were done full script. 2 of the books were done. 2 of the books were done Marvel style. Now I have to clarify. Some people hear Marvel style and they heard the old stories of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and Stan goes, "Let's bring back Dr. Doom," and Jack goes home and does 4 issues of a story with Stan dialogues. That's not Marvel method. My plots are very detailed, very long, full of, dialogue and psychological layering and broken down page by page, panel by panel. But the beauty of it is when you're working Marvel style that way is it goes off to the artist who then has the freedom to play with it, but you get the art back. So it's sort of like what Keith and I would do together. I get to do alone because now I'm collaborating with myself. So I get the art back. I look at the plot and I go, but I want to change this. Oh, this part that I thought would be on page 5, I can put this on page 10. All that information I put there, I don't actually need that. I just had an idea for something else I could throw in.
Oh, wow.
So you know what I mean? I get to layer things in a different way when I'm writing from my own plot, but writing from the art. And the 2 examples I'll give you. One is like we want to talk about Craven. Working with Mike Zeck on Craven. Mike is an impeccable storyteller, right?
Yes.
Everything that's in the plot is there on the page. You don't have to. Sometimes, with comic book art, if the guy's not up to snuff, you see it in the script. You have to explain what's in the art, in the copy, which really slows a story down. Oh, I tripped over that spear and I'm falling off the roof, Craven said. You know what I mean? And you wonder why is that dialogue in that comic? Because the art didn't do it. So you had to go in and add that to clarify it. With a guy like Mike, the emotions, the surface emotions are all there. So what's going on in Craven's Last Hunt? It's all interior dialogue. because Mike delivered everything that I needed visually. I was free. Another artist, I might have been writing to compensate for weaknesses in the art. It might have been much more on the surface. And the other thing, which I've said many times, but I love to bring it up because it's the truth, working with Sal Buscema, the brilliant Sal Buscema on Spectacular Spider-Man 200. I write the plot, very detailed, and I know at the end of the story when Harry Osborn dies, I'm going to have to really sell it and write a lot and schmaltz it up and dialogue and captions and all this stuff. And then I get Sal's art, and I get to the last 2 or 3 pages, and everything I asked for in my plot was there. I had started to write something. I went, I don't have to write anything. It's all there in the art. So if you look at the end of that story, there's silent pages at the end of the book. Yeah. So that's the joy of Marvel Method. The fun of Full Script is you're doing the whole thing right then and there. You're visualizing it all. You're writing all the copy. You're doing everything. You're in total control of the story. And it's fun to work that way as well. So I love both ways. That's the way. When I started in the business at DC, I was writing full script. Then you go to Marvel, and they were doing it plot first. So I learned both ways. But but even with full script, give that script to 6 different artists. You're going to get 6 different interpretations of the story, because the artist's job is just look at one panel. So I describe, the 2 guys are in a room having a conversation. One of them is angry and he's waving. Well, the 6 guys are going to draw that a different way.
Yeah.
And then and so sometimes even with full script, you go in at the end, you look the art over, and you may want to add something here, or you might want to take something out there, because you're always adjusting. So, like I said, writing and art, they're like this. You can't separate them. So whether it's full script or Marvel style, it's that fusion of the two that's so important.
Yeah, comic books. I don't think any other
great question.
His art and words meshed so.
And that's the other thing too. There's a lot of freedom in comics, because even so even when you're working on the Marvel stuff, and I have to say back in the 80s, 90s, we had a lot more freedom, even more freedom. But even now, so it's a writer, it's an artist, and an editor. That's the whole team. And between the 3 of you, you're working it all out. Not I've had meetings for projects or TV movie stuff I've worked on, where I get on the phone, and it's like 9 people on the other end of the phone giving notes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's very intimate. And then when you get to create your own comics, it's like there's no guardrails. It's just you, and you're falling through space, trying to build a story on the way down, and it's great. It's great. It's a wonderful medium. But, I love the other stuff too. I love writing for TV. I've, especially with the DC animation stuff, I've gotten to work with so many great guys, the Jim Kriegs and Dwayne McDuffies and Stan Berkowitz and everybody, Bruce Timm, and on and on and on.
Legends, every one of them. Okay, Dominic, do you have a favorite age of comic books? Golden, silver, bronze, copper, outside of comic books, or any bands? So he's getting a lot of questions in on one comment.
Wow. Okay. Let's see. I'll see if I can. I think you're in love with the stuff you read when you were growing up. I can read stuff now and go, this is great, but it's not going to settle into your heart and soul the way it did when you were a kid.
Right.
So whether it's when I was really little, reading the DC stuff and the square-jawed Batman and the Silver Age Superman, or when I discovered Marvel and it was all Lee and Kirby and all those guys, or then when I was a teenager in the 70s is one of the greatest eras for comics ever. What those guys were doing then, all those guys we talked about. So that those are the eras, probably the 60s and 70s that mean the most to me. And any bands and musicians I still listen to. Well, I always have been and always will be a hardcore Beatles fan. It's and I always say I major in the Beatles with a minor in John Lennon. Lennon is my rock and roll hero. But the great thing about the age of streaming, like I have Spotify, you can discover so much new stuff. And then you read, I read an article in the Times about this band Florence and the Machine. Okay, and you go to Spotify, like, I love Florence and the Machine. Aren't they fantastic? I also have a son who's always likes to turn me on to new music. Otherwise, I'd be lost in my 60s or 70s music cocoon, And so it's wonderful that you can, the whole world is at our fingertips musically. So I have playlists, with current stuff, with old stuff, Indian music, classical music, whatever it is,
Right here in my hand, I could listen to the sum total of all musical composition in the history of the world.
It's very rare that you can't find something you're looking for, and that's a great thing.
I know you'll take this as a compliment, but reading all of your work, I knew you were a Beatles fan. I love it.
Yeah. I
When you
still, go ahead.
Oh, I was going on to Abrax. When you write characters with long histories, you go back and review much before you start on a new project?
To some degree, you have to. You have to know the characters. But with someone like Magneto, it's like, I'm not going to read every Magneto story ever written. I have the stuff that I know that I read, and then they sent me, like, I wasn't familiar with that New Mutants era, so they sent me a ton of the New Mutants comics to go through, so I read enough of those that I was familiar with that. And then you hope that your editor is smart enough to know you can't do that, because 27 years ago on panel 3 of issue 72, he said this,
Right.
When I first started in the business, that I would do that. I would buy, like, I remember when I started, I wrote Aquaman, one of my first gigs at DC, one of my first superhero gigs. And so I went out and bought like all these Aquaman back issues because I had to read them all. It was basically a great excuse to buy more comics, but I don't do that anymore. I read now what I need to read for that story, but that's the great thing too. Like I said, all these years, like writing for comics and animation, there were days where it's like, I had a lot of work to do today. I had to read a ton of comics and watch cartoons, and I always say, if I could go back in time to my 10 or 12-year-old self and say, you know what I did today? I read comics and watched cartoons, and it was work. He would just faint.
Yeah.
I'm going to sidebar just with one little story.
Sure.
When I was starting out in the business, and I began my relationship with Jim Shooter, and he read my work and he would throw me a fill-in issue or whatever just to kind of get me in the door. One of the gigs he threw me, they were suing. There was a cartoon called Web Woman that was on for a short time, I guess in the late 70s. This must be 79 or 80 when this happened. And they were suing them because it was too similar to Spider-Man. So they needed someone to watch Web Woman cartoons and write up notes to give to the lawyers. So, okay, so you want to come up to the office for like a week and come in like it's your job, And where did they put me? Stan Lee's office.
Wow.
Stan's out in the West Coast. So I'm sure I wasn't paid a lot, but I got paid to sit in Stan Lee's office for a week or two, whatever it was, and watch cartoons.
Wow.
I mean, come on.
Mom, I'm off to work.
Right, exactly. Bye.
That is
Very
awesome.
Funny. Yeah.
How many people join your writing classes?
I've done them. I do them with a regular irregularity. I haven't done one now, I have to say, for about a year and a half, maybe. When COVID came along, I did a couple online classes, and I really need to reboot them. It's great fun. It's called Imagination 101. If you go to my website, you'll see there's a whole page devoted to that. And we spend, when it's done live in person, it's a whole weekend. When I do it online, we break it up over to 2 weekends, just exploring writing for, comics and animation. And really, it's not limited to that. It's really about the art of storytelling. And we all get together in a room or online, and it's a great experience, I hope, for them, but I know it's a great experience for me because I always learn something. And the other thing that I do, I have and you'll also find it on my website. It's called Creation Point Story Consultation, where I work with people one-on-one. They come to me and they say, well, I've got a comic book miniseries. I've got a screenplay. I've got a piece of prose. Excuse me. Will you work with me on that? And that's been very rewarding. And that I'm still doing. So anyone, if you want to work with me one-on-one, check it out. Bring me your work. And it's so rewarding. And to sit as I have with someone who comes to me with an idea, and by the time we're done, they've written a 5-issue miniseries, and I get to be like a creative midwife, to the birth of that child. Cool. And it's really, it's very, very gratifying and very exciting.
Okay. It's been an hour and we got 3 questions.
Okay. So all right. I'm happy to do the 3 questions. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll finish up. Enjoyed your work, Mr. DeMatteis. Thank you for the great work. Condolences for losing. Okay. I thought this was a question.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. It's rough to lose, and so close together, so close together. Very sad, but thank you very much.
Okay. Any other Dan Green painted artworks?
That's a great question. I know he hasn't done a lot. He did some gallery shows. He illustrated some books. I think it was Edgar Allan Poe stuff that he did these beautiful illustrations for. I have it downstairs in my library. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but in comics, I know he drew a few issues of the Doctor Strange comic, but they weren't painted.
Yeah.
I think the only painted work he did in comics was Into Shambhala.
Yeah, that is so striking. And here, I guess
hello to whoever just said hello, hello.
Oh, that Hex Allen says hello. You get a
the
hello.
The other one said, "Do I regret choosing
Yeah.
comics as a profession?" No.
No.
Why? How could you regret? You take the thing that you were in love with as a kid, being creative, writing, drawing, loving comics, loving stories, and then next thing you know, these characters that you read about when you were a kid, you're in charge of their destiny. You're writing their stories, and you get to create your own worlds and your own stories. And then on top of that, being in comics opened all these other doors to TV, to movies, to novels, to all these things, because this little kid loved to be creative and loved to read comics. I regret it. No, I am so profoundly grateful. It's funny. I always say God didn't make me capable of doing anything else except being creative. So I would have been in deep trouble trying to make it in the 9-to-5 world.
So it was either comics or homeless. There you go.
Or finding a very rich wife.
And I think that's why I'm still loving your work. Your newest work I'm still loving. Those 5 comics that just came out of Kickstarter. I got that same feeling that I got when I first read Greenberg the Vampire.
Thank you.
Because you love these characters. You can tell.
You have to be in love with them. You can't write this stuff without being in love with them. You just have to.
So we'll close it out now. After an hour, man, I can't believe the hour went by so fast. Thank you so much. Everybody's thanking you in the chat. The Beatles, Helter Skelter, Dan Green is one of my favorite artists. Yeah, I agree with you, Dan.
It was nice to see after Dan passed, to see all the people on social media that, it's a shame. The shame is it's after someone dies, and suddenly like the past couple of weeks, it's Keith. Everywhere you go, it's Keith. And, we go to conventions and that people love and appreciate the work, but there's a certain sadness to like, God, we should have been doing the tribute to Keith Giffen, last year. People should have been talking about Dan last year.
Yes.
While they were still here to appreciate it.
Absolutely. I feel the same. My sister passed this week.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And we're just like, the day before her daughter's wedding. How's that for a kick?
Oh, God.
So, and we're all just like, we were all planning on going to dinner, going to visit, and you know what I mean? So life is short is, I guess, what we're learning.
It is. And, and it's always a reminder to appreciate people right here and right now. It's so important to not wait to give a speech at their funeral. Tell them now when they're here.
Yeah, absolutely right. Again, I'm getting emotional, but I'm a New Yorker.
I'm really sorry to hear about your sister. It's like I was looking at this video. I found some. When we go to conventions, my wife would take these little videos of the panels. I'd put them up on YouTube. And there's Keith, and it's like, your brain, there's a disconnect in your brain. I'm looking at Keith. He's right there. How could he not be here?
Yeah. And his last tweet was goofy, I told you I was sick. Do anything to get out of New York Comic Con.
Right.
Guy went out making us laugh,
Yeah, he was an amazing guy.
Yeah, and the comic industry doesn't treat their elders well. You're absolutely right, Marcus. You're absolutely right. I could go on and that, but I want to leave this, I don't want JM to be mad at me as we say goodbye.
No, it's important to stay positive. I try, like with my social media, I really try to keep it positive, because there's enough, as we all we have to do is turn on the news. There's enough pain and negativity in the world, The world, the past few years have been like the worst Twilight Zone episode in the history.
That's right. Turn off Black Mirror reality. Let's.
Yeah, exactly. So the more we can do as individuals to pour a little light, a little compassion, a little kindness into the world,
Yes, absolutely.
So don't waste your time on social media being negative to people. Let's celebrate the things and the people that we love.
Well, that's why I started this channel, to talk comic books with people that love comic books. Whether we politically disagree or not, I want to talk about something that I love. If you love comics, it's evident. And I think I'm trying to stay positive, and I hope you had a good time talking tonight.
I did. This was really a pleasure. I really had a great time.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Maybe we can do it again a few months down the line.
Oh, I would love to.
Anytime. We can continue. Yeah, that's great.
Anytime you want to, I'll reach out to you in a couple of months. Thank you so much for saying that.
And thank you to everybody that's watching and asking questions and stuff.
That's how I know somebody liked my cooking, when they say, "Can I have another serving?" So when somebody says, "I'll come back," thank you.
So before we go, the most important question: where in Brooklyn did you grow up?
I grew up. My parents were born in Brooklyn, East New York. I grew up
Okay.
on Long Island, but
Oh, you did? Okay.
all of my relatives were from Brooklyn, so it was a long time
Oh, I see. Got
back
it.
and forth, going back and forth. I'm a construction worker. I worked in Brooklyn. I worked in Queens. I worked pretty much every borough except the Bronx, believe it or not.
Okay.
So, you know, it's part of who I am. You know, my all my uncles, my grandparents, they all lived in it, and I spent a lot of my childhood in and out of Brooklyn. But even though I grew up in Nassau County.
Oh, I got it. Got it. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Where did you grow up? Now that you.
Well, when I was born in Williamsburg.
Oh, okay. Wow. If you had left those houses.
my father grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant back when it was all Italian. My
Yep.
mother grew up in Williamsburg. It was very Jewish at that point, you know.
Italian and Jewish.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
So I was overweight as a kid because I was very well fed. And then when I was like 4 or 5 years old, we moved to the Midwood section. I lived on Ocean Avenue, not far from Brooklyn College and Midwood High School. My public school, PS 152, was over here. Across the street was Midwood High School, and across the street from that was Brooklyn College. Believe it or not, they were all in this little same area across from each other. So that's where I grew up. No. But I'm so grateful that I grew up there. You know what I mean? It's a part of me. It's a part of me. I couldn't go back. I've lived in sort of a more of a George Bailey, Bedford Falls kind of place for the past 40 years, you know? So the quiet, more countrified life. So I don't think.
I live out in the country now. You know, there was a deer on my front lawn a couple of weeks
ago.
Yeah,
the deer are everywhere right now this time of year. Everywhere I go, there's deer staring at me. So, so could I go back? No. Do I miss it? No. But, you know, read Brooklyn Dreams. It lives on in my heart forever, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I grew up watching Woody Allen movies, stuff like that, but I don't want to go back I go back once in a while to take an old lady food shopping. Mm-hmm. And my wife says I come home furious. You know, I couldn't park anywhere near her apartment. I got a 90-year-old woman. I'm carrying her through the streets.
We got to go, but you said that.
Yes, I'm sorry.
My memory is we didn't get a car till I was like in the 6th grade because we couldn't afford one. So we finally got a car. And we'd go somewhere on a Sunday, and my father would pull up in front of our apartment building, drop us off, and go look for a parking spot. And see you in a couple hours. You know what I mean? Literally sometimes.
Yes. Or you sit double parked waiting for the good spot.
Oh, thank you for that comment, Dominic. I agree. Yeah. Don't want to drown ourselves in cynicism and nihilism.
And
there's enough of that in the world.
And it's easy to do. But
thank you, John. This was a real pleasure. And let's do it again.
Thank you so much. All right, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.